The country with the lowest, healthiest levels of blood sugar are not these blue zone countries or these countries that are eating beautiful, colorful plates of food. It's not the things that you would think. As a matter of fact, the country with the lowest level of blood sugar, healthiest blood sugar levels, is actually a diet that's kind of bland looking and on the surface might even look unhealthy. And as a whole, we look at the country and we think, well, maybe that's not a healthy country. And we're going to kind of break down the countries that have the best glucose and the worst glucose, but we're going to talk about what they eat in the countries that have the best glucose levels. Now, the best way to measure this when you're looking at countries is not looking at instance of type 2 diabetes. It's more looking at what is called IGT, impaired glucose tolerance testing, because this shows as a whole how people respond to glucose. If you have impaired glucose tolerance, it means your tolerance to sugar or carbohydrates or glucose is not good. So the higher the score, the more impaired glucose tolerance. So you can look at it as a whole. You want to have a low level of impaired glucose tolerance. Now, the countries that have the highest levels of unhealthy blood sugar, impaired glucose tolerance, parts of China, okay? And then you also have Mexico, Germany, and Switzerland. Very, very interesting, okay? Because Switzerland is also one of the healthiest countries. But it's interesting because the neighboring countries influence Switzerland a lot. So the regions of Switzerland that are close to Germany, which happens to be on the unhealthy list to begin with, have more of that influence, whereas the ones that have more of the French, particularly the Italian influence, have a longer life expectancy. That's a separate point. But believe it or not, America's not as high as we would have thought. I mean, it's a close second. America, Canada, Brazil fall in second place behind those countries I just mentioned. Well, the countries that have the lowest levels of impaired glucose tolerance, so the best overall glucose, you've got countries like Ireland, Romania, actually even parts of China, which is kind of wild, and they're at about 4% of the population. But the ones that were the lowest were Latvia and Russia at 3.5%. Compare that to like the United States at 11 and 12%. So a significantly less amount of the population having unhealthy levels of blood sugar. We're going to focus on Russia because there's more data there. Now, we don't want to take everything that the Russians are saying to the bank when it comes to diet because their longevity isn't all that great. But there's definitely something they're doing metabolically that's good for glucose. So maybe we can take some bits and pieces from it. Now, when you look at their diet, it's a lot of animal protein, a lot of meat, a lot of dairy. They do have some carbs we're going to talk about. They have some specific porridges, Kasha, they consume buckwheat, quinoa, things like that. They also consume a lot of dairy, a lot of yogurt. They have like a soured milk they drink a lot of that's kind of a custom. They've got milk in general. They've got cottage cheese. They've got lots of sour cream. So a lot of that. Again, things on the surface that don't necessarily look like healthy foods compared to like bright Mediterranean colors. So we're going to break this down individually. The number one thing that is probably hugely beneficial for them that people overlook is the crap ton of pickled foods that they eat. They eat a lot of pickled vegetables. Not only are they getting the vegetable content and the fiber, but the gut health impact and how that impacts overall glucose metabolism and blood sugar is much, much more than people give it credit for. There was a study published in Frontiers in Public Health that for 10 years monitored people's diets, and they found a very strong association. The more pickled vegetables, the less the risk of type 2 diabetes. They found that if you ate about a half a kilogram per month of pickled vegetables, your risk of type 2 diabetes was dramatically reduced. What is the main influence here? Well, for one, it's the fiber, but the real thing is here, think about it. In Russia, it's cold. You can't always have vegetables year round. So the fermentation process, pickling, became big so you could have vegetables in the wintertime. Well, when these vegetables are pickled and they culture, you have a high degree of probiotics that form. Think kimchi, because people know kimchi, right? Very healthy for the gut. How is this working? If you want me to get into the particulars, I can, but I have other videos that explain that. The long story short is that basically when you consume pickled vegetables and you have more of these probiotics, you create more of these compounds that can modulate glucose through digestion and in the bloodstream. I have noticed this specifically with myself. If I wear a continuous glucose monitor where I can monitor everything that I eat, when I eat pickled vegetables or when I consume more probiotics or when I consume more in the way of fermented milk, things change. It's not just a long-term game, it's even short-term. I notice a huge change in my glucose. The best thing that you can do is monitor your glucose and see how you respond to these different things. So as we talk about some of these other Russian-influenced foods, I would encourage you to add them into your diet and then use a continuous glucose monitor to kind of see what happens to your glucose. Very clear links between glucose metabolism and longevity as well. So if we can factor this in, it's important. You don't need to get like a typical doctor note to get a continuous glucose monitor. There's a company called Signos. I put a link in the top line of the description for 15% off through them. You get a Dexcom, which is the kind of gold standard of a continuous glucose monitor. And then you use the Signos app, which allows you to take the data from the continuous glucose monitor, and it gives you like very simple spelled out range of glucose that you should be in. And anytime you eat something, you can see in real time how your blood sugar is responding. Like you could eat a banana and within seconds, look at it on your phone and watch your blood sugars doing. You're truly like becoming bionic and can see some cool stuff. It is awesome, awesome, awesome. And they use some cool algorithmic technology to make it easy, but also tell you when you should exercise, tell you when you should maybe eat, all these kinds of things, and to give you that healthy range to stay in. So again, it's a 15% off discount link in the top line of the description underneath this video. They are a sponsor on this video and on this channel, so any support that you give them directly helps this channel as well. This next one, if you know Russia, you know there's a staple dish called Kasha. It's sort of like a porridge. Now, different regions and different influences have different forms of this. But generally speaking, buckwheat and quinoa are huge staples of it. Now, buckwheat is a very unique pseudo cereal. It's not a typical grain. Okay, it is a pseudo cereal because it acts just like quinoa, sort of like a cereal, sort of like a grain, but it's gluten-free and it's not really a grain. Okay. Very low glycemic and high soluble fiber content. So considering this is like a huge staple for them as a carbohydrate source, and it's a heck of a lot better than having like, say, a bowl of frosted mini wheats or something, right? Now with this, there's also compounds in buckwheat that speed up glycogen synthase and also speed up what is called pyruvate dehydrogenase. Greek, but basically what that means is it's helping you dispose of glucose. By speeding up pyruvate dehydrogenase, you speed up how quickly you dispose of extra glucose so you can get on a healthier level sooner. So there's definitely something going on there. Now, when you look at the other carbohydrate sources they eat, sure, there's potatoes, and sure, there's rice. Sure, there's unhealthy things too, but it's definitely something to look at that a staple is something so low glycemic. So I have added buckwheat into my diet because I don't consume gluten, but I encourage us to bake with it. Now, a lot of times you do have to kind of cut it with something. So maybe buckwheat with a little bit of potato flour or a little bit of rice flour, but making the predominant flour buckwheat in your baking, you can notice a huge difference. They also eat a bunch of rye bread, which does have gluten, but the interesting thing about rye in Russia is it's pure like unrefined rye. And rye is one of the highest soluble fiber content foods that's out there. So you're talking about a fiber that's a lot like chia, where it kind of gets gelatinous. So it has a huge glycemic impact, meaning it slows down the absorption of carbohydrates. But then also with this, you also have a lot of phenolic compounds that impact your glucose overall. But let's not forget like the big piece here. There's a lot of meat consumption. And one of the things that we are now seeing to be very true is how protein attenuates glucose. So could this be the biggest piece overall? It might actually be. Like the fact that a good portion of their diet is going to be from good quality meat, that is going to attenuate glucose. But you add in these other things that are sort of ancillary, you got a pretty good little recipe there. One of the most interesting things though, and this ties in with so much of the glucose talk that we talk about, is there was a study in 2023 in ISPOS. This is like the second or third largest like data company when it comes down to like sports exercise stuff. Okay, they were looking at 29 different countries to see which countries have the most activity. 29 different countries, Russia placed 4th. So they were very high up there with over 9 hours per week of exercise on average. That's so cool. They are into sports. And a lot of the sports they're into are like high intensity, like hockey, sprinting, combat, whatever, those kinds of sports where you're sucking up glucose like crazy. Not to say that other forms of exercise aren't good, but there's something there. And 9 hours a week, that's wild. What's even more extreme is that only 7% of the population don't exercise. 7% don't exercise. That means 93% of the population exercises. The only countries that were different from that are going to be India and the Netherlands at 4 and 5%. So they have a lot of exercise, a lot of activity. Now, this isn't always incorporating like full-on sort of artificial exercise. It's just high activity levels. Okay, so even though they're not the most active countries in the world or the most healthiest, they at least have a lot of people that are actively engaging in these things. Okay, so what we can take away from this is that their low glycemic lifestyle definitely plays a part. Their active lifestyle and their commitment to exercise plays a huge part. Their protein intake plays a ridiculous part. And of course, their contribution to their gut biome by focusing on pickled vegetables. Better yet, not focusing on them, just letting them be a part of their life. I'm sure there's a good portion of the year where it's cold and they're just consuming pickled vegetables. And at least there's a concerted enough effort to say, I still want vegetables even when they're not fresh. So for those of you living in flyover states in the United States, maybe it's something that you consider. Because I can tell you for one, my mother-in-law lives in Wyoming and she says, I can't get good vegetables. And I try to tell her, you can find a way. Pickled asparagus, pickled vegetables, pickled broccoli, ferment your own. There is a way. And where there's a will, there's certainly a way. As always, I'll keep it locked in here on my channel. See you tomorrow.